That first night, the beers that I clutched to me as I ran down the hall were the only things that let me get any sleep at all. I woke up the next morning, squinting into the daylight leaking in through my curtains, and for a minute I couldn't remember what I had been afraid of. It was like waking up from a nightmare as the details of whatever horrible thing that haunted my mind faded out in the light of day. But my brain held on to the fear. My breath came in shallow jets from my nose, and my eyes scanned the room erratically. I didn't remember the source of my anxiety until I spied the boxes of unpacked clothes and books stacked in front of my bedroom door. Once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that the door was taunting me. Peeking over the wall of boxes I'd built for some semblance of peace of mind. Wanting to rid my brain of that image, I closed my eyes and dropped my head into my hands with a tired sigh. Behind my eyelids, the basement door was waiting instead, glaring white in the light of the kitchen. The image flickered to my kitchen bathed in darkness. With dread, I watched the weak yellow light flare up under the door. Again, the image changed, and there, beneath the door, the shadow of feet, standing and waiting expectantly. Anyone home? I opened my eyes and was greeted with my own white bedroom door behind the boxes, a churning in my stomach threatening to bubble over. I flopped wearily back to my pillow. I've never really been one to believe in the supernatural, not out loud at least. There was always that section at the back of my brain that I tried desperately to keep quiet, the what-if part of my brain. As I laid there in my bed that morning, that part of my brain was screaming, demanding answers, and so I set out to get some. The first step was to check the house. Moving the boxes was a slow process. Not that they were heavy or that there were many of them. They were relatively light, and I'd only had 4 or 5 in the room with me. But every little noise the house made in the morning quiet was some stalking, lurking thing waiting on the other side of my bedroom door, at least in my mind. Nonetheless, I cleared the path out of my bedroom, cautiously opened the door inch by inch, and peered out into the rest of the house. The hallway was dark and quiet. Everything was still in the house, except for the loud ticking of the clock in the living room. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the hallway. The bathroom off the hallway was clear. Nothing in the living room either. Everything was in the state that I'd left it the night before. 1 or 2 empty beer bottles on the coffee table, a pizza box lazily tossed by the front door. But I checked every corner, in the closet, under the couch even. Part of this was just me wanting to be thorough, but the larger part was the what-if part of my brain, just looking for reasons to put off going to the kitchen. Eventually, the kitchen was all that was left to check. As I crossed the threshold from the living room to kitchen, I couldn't make my eyes look up at the basement door. They were happy to scan the fridge and the cabinets for as long as can be. But the prospect of seeing that white door waiting for me again was making my head swim. But once again, at some point, all that's left to do is the thing you would do absolutely anything to avoid. I looked at the door. There it was. Just a door. It didn't stretch out at me or groan with the weight of 1,000 souls. It just sat there like it had been waiting for me to wake up. Hey there, how'd you sleep? Any dreams? I dreamed about you. I shook my head to clear the shadow puppets I was casting on the walls of my own mind. It was just a door, goddammit. This was my house, and I had to grow the hell up. With the sound of my heartbeat drowning out the ticking of the living room clock, I moved slowly towards the basement door. I was standing right in front of it before I noticed I was holding my breath. As noiselessly as I could, I exhaled and took a few slow, steady gulps of air. My heart shuddered, its beat in my chest sending shockwaves through my body. All the while, the door stood unmoved. I stood there for longer than I cared to admit, before finally reaching my hand out and trying the knob. To my trembling relief, it was securely locked. I tried a couple more times just to be sure, leaning my weight against the wood and gripping the knob tightly as I shook it. Nothing. I pressed my ear up against the door's surface and listened, holding my breath once more. 1 second ticked into 10, into 30, into a minute. Nothing. I breathed a deep, lungful of air and let out gratefully as I stepped back from the door, momentarily satisfied with my lack of findings. As I turned and walked away from the basement door to the fridge, it seemed more and more likely that I'd scared myself into a semi-drunken stupor the night before. The cold leftover pizza from last night served as my comfort for the morning. I stood, leaning against the sink, and chomped on the slice of pepperoni, thankful for what was finally starting to feel like a normal enough morning. A tinkling sound came from behind the basement door, broke this temporary peace. I stopped chewing and listened intently. Silence filled the kitchen, sudden and overbearing. Then it came again, a tiny jangling noise that wasn't exactly unfamiliar. I had heard this noise before, but where? An image began to form in my brain. A thin cord dangling from the center of the ceiling connected to a solitary light bulb above several mounds of junk, as my middle-aged landlord fumbled for the chain. The chain danced across the glassy surface of the light bulb, making a small but unmistakable clinking sound. The sound repeated, outside of my head this time, and my eyes flew to the basement door. A new image of something ancient, decaying and dead, dragging itself across the piles of forgotten things and groping for the chain with skeletal fingers sprang into my brain. Despite the tremors rocketing through my hands, I moved slowly but steadily back toward the basement door. Again, I pressed my ear to the wood and listened. No light jangling noise came, but the clear sound of a chain being tugged. Looking down, I could see soft yellow light under the crack of the door. I couldn't believe it. It was like a nightmare had followed me out into the day. But there it was, regardless. With a great swell of will, I forced myself to stoop down on my knees and lowered my head slowly to the crack under the door. Knock, knock, knock. I fell backwards away from the door and scooted myself down the length of the kitchen, blubbering and stammering half words and squeaking sounds of fear. Through the crack, the shadow of 2 feet turned and moved back from the door. I heard the chain tugged again, and the light beneath the door disappeared. It was a mad dash, getting dressed and out of the house. I needed to be somewhere else. I called up my friend Pat and asked if I could swing by and hang out for a while. He said that'd be fine and asked if I was alright. With a shaky voice, I told him I was fine, because it's hard to explain over the phone that either you're going insane or your new house has some uninvited presence in the off-limits basement. I'd explain myself when I got there. Probably. On the way, I gave Murray a call. It went straight to voicemail. Murray McDonald's Properties. Leave your name, number and brief description of your reason for calling, and I will address your needs as I can. The beeping tone invited me to begin my message, and I didn't know what exactly to say. Quickly starting to speak, I gave my name and number along with my address. The last thing I said was definitely brief, but felt cartoonishly ominous coming out of my mouth, making me worry about how I would seem to anyone I talked to about this. There's something wrong with the basement. Please call me back ASAP. I left it at that and hung up. If he was allowed to be cryptic and unhelpful, then I was allowed to be nervous and vague. When I reached Pat's house, he had 5 guys for both of us, and I ate it gratefully, realizing how hungry I was. We munched and watched TV for a while, and my mind started to unclench from the night and morning I had gone through on my own. But the day went on, and the morning turned to afternoon. Soon it would be night, and I would be out of reasons to stay at my friend's place. Then, somewhere amidst the Netflix and video games, Pat asked me the question. "So, what was up this morning? You sounded pretty freaked out." For a moment, I debated telling Pat anything, because I already knew how crazy this all seemed. And this year hasn't been a stellar one for my mental well-being already. I've already worried some folks, but this wasn't that. I told Pat what had happened last night and this morning. He didn't laugh. He didn't give me that heavy look of concern that I'd received so often from so many others. He listened, and when I was done, he looked me in the eye with a strong, steady gaze. "Well, I think we should go back there together." "What?" "Look, man, either this is legitimately the freakiest thing to ever happen to anyone I know, or it's part of some of the stuff you've been working through. Either way, I don't want you to mess with it all by yourself." I faltered a little and returned his stare dumbly. He just smiled and spoke again. "I'll grab my stuff." Pat stood, clapped me on the back, and went to his room, returning with a backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked at me with eyebrows raised, like he was daring me to tell him no. Pat had always been a fierce friend of mine. I can't tell you how glad I was for him in that moment. We both climbed into my car, and I drove back to my house. We pulled up to the house as the sun was ducking beneath the horizon, laying dusk over the world like a blanket. My stomach was tight as we climbed out of the car. We reached the front door, and my phone went off, making us both jump. I looked at the screen. It was Murray. "It's the landlord," I told Pat, unlocking the door to let him in. "Let's see what he has to say." Pat laughed and went in the door. I accepted the call and put the receiver to my ear. "Do not go back in the house." The words boomed staticky and harsh from the phone, and the front door slammed shut in front of me. I dropped the phone and hammered my fist on the door, calling out to my friend. The doorknob didn't budge in my grip. Desperate, I tried my key once again, and they were flung out of the lock, whizzing past me into the yard. I watched them sail away from me, eyes wide. I slammed once more into the door, and it gave in, sending me spiraling into the hallway of the house. The door swung violently on its hinges and struck the wall, bouncing back for a lazy half swing. The house was completely dark, but I spied light on the wall of the living room opposite the kitchen. A shadow moved there, the shadow of a man. I slowly turned and moved out of the light. I called out then, "Pat? Where are you, Pat? We gotta go." I scurried forward on my hands and knees, rounding the corner into the living room. I stopped when I could see into the kitchen. The overhead lights were off. The only light was coming from the doorway to the basement. The door was open, and Pat was gone. The tinkling, tugging noise sounded once more, and the basement light went out.